welcome to today's Table Talks. My name is Scott Kappelman, and I'm joined by my two co-hosts again today. We've got Clark McGehee, who's back from vacation. So, Clark,
yes,
how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm glad to be back. I missed it last week. I was able to listen in, and I think you guys both did a fantastic job, but I felt a little bit of FOMO, fear of missing out. I was like, yeah, man,
I thought you were worried about Tyce mentioning the word coup, as in we removed you from the podcast or from the video.
I did hear that, and I was thinking, wow, okay, I'm going to have to talk to Tyce about this, but no, I was assuming he was joking. So
he was. Yeah. We missed you last week.
Well,
Hope you had a good time
much
on the vacation.
Yes, we did. It was
all right,
a big
great.
blessing.
And Tyce, you're back with us again.
I am.
How are you feeling today?
Feeling good. A little sunburnt from my experience at camp.
Yeah, you got a chance to visit with your family and go back to a former camp that you've served in the past. So it was a good experience.
A very great experience.
Did they want to recruit you to come back and work at the camp?
No.
Okay.
They were happy. They were happy. They had their relationships for 3 months. So.
That's fine.
All right. Well, today we're going to talk about tithing, which can be controversial at times. And so we're going to try to get into this subject. First of all, I wanted to start with a question. How did each of you first learn about tithing, and how was it taught to you? So, Tyce, you want to dive into that first?
Mm-hmm. So, I've heard about tithing just from my parents. They've talked about it. And I think that was a very generic overview of it, and just like that we give this to God. But I think when I really learned about it was from a Sunday school teacher. I think it was a little skewed what I learned, and just that this is an absolute, like this is the law, we have to do this or we are robbing from God. And so from what I saw from my parents and what I learned were two different things, I believe.
Okay.
So
what about you, Clark?
Yeah, my mom taught me very similar that it was like in the law, we're going to tithe 10%. And she still today thinks that to be true. I mean, she thinks that she's your classic Southern Baptist, 50-year-old. She wouldn't want me to say how old she is on the podcast, but your classic Southern Baptist that grew up in that age. She's like, tithing is the way to go. We have to do it. And she even goes as far as she's not a prosperity believer at all. But I think this happens to a lot of people that believe in tithing. She's like, if we give our 10% to the Lord, he will bless us. And
I've heard that expressed many times.
Yeah, not in a prosperity way, really, but she just says the Lord always provides. And it's almost like because I give my 10%.
Mm-hmm. So when I was growing up, my parents on Saturday night, we always laid our clothes out. My dad was a pastor, so I grew up in the same way that Tyce did. And we laid our clothes out. We found our Bibles and put them by our clothes. And then my parents would come through, one of them, and give us a quarter. And so it was not a true tithe in terms of 10% like you're talking about. But at the same time, they wanted to make sure we understood when we get to church tomorrow, when the offering plate goes by, you need to give a small portion back to God. And here's your quarter. And then as I got a little older, it got to be 50 cents. And then I think at one point it became $1 until I began to earn my own money. And then I think my parents, even though I don't know that they believe this, but to get me on the right foot, they would remind me after every paycheck, 10% of that needs to go to God.
Right.
And so I don't know if that was their real core belief or if that was just the way they were training me. So those first paychecks from the grocery store where I worked, I had to give 10%.
That makes sense.
So that's how it got started for me.
Okay.
All right, so we all three had a background in tithing.
Yes, we did.
Let's talk about the biblical roots of tithing. And most people, I think, want to go to Genesis 4, which is where Cain and Abel make their sacrifices. Cain offers one from the fruits of the field, and Abel offers a meat sacrifice from the best of his flock. And I think most people want to start there. I do have a question, though. And I asked this to you guys in the hallway before we got started a little while ago. Do you think that's really the roots of tithing, or do you think that might have been their methodology of trying to earn God's favor in light of what happened to their parents when they sinned? God slaughtered an animal to cover them with the skins. And so was it really about a tithe, or was it them trying to maybe in their own way gain favor with God? Have you ever thought about that?
I think it's an incredible question. When you asked it, I just always laugh because you're such a question asker and you always just try to provoke thought. And honestly, I don't exactly know the answer just because we weren't there, of course, and we can't be in there. We can't be in their minds, but purely on speculation sense, I do think that it would probably be a little more of to gain favor, because it's like, what else would they know? I mean, surely they wouldn't just come up with this random idea to just start giving. So we can't know for sure, but purely from speculating, I feel like the latter part of that would be the truer part. What do you think, Tyce?
No, I think it was a great question to be posed, and I could not answer it in the moment. But sitting here thinking, it's just human instinct. When there's someone greater than you that's present, you want to give your best to them in some way, just earn a favor. Prideful insight or not, whatever you're feeling, there's a sense of wanting to give to gain favor. And so I do think there was this, not a tithe, like God deserves this, but God is greater than me, so I should give.
Mm.
I'll have to confess, I've preached on tithing in the past, and I've started in this location, especially if I did a series on tithing. I would usually start with Cain and Abel, and it's not until recently that thought crossed my mind that maybe that's not about tithing as much as trying to earn God's favor with a sacrifice, which even if you look at it from that context, and again, I'm like you, Clark, I totally agree. I don't know if we'll ever know till we get to heaven, get to ask the Lord about it. And he probably will say, does it really matter now? And
Yeah,
say, no, it really doesn't. But it just kind of made me think, they just saw their parent, or they heard the stories from their parents. They didn't see it because these children came along later, but they heard their parents talk about how God sacrificed an animal because they were unworthy. And maybe it's more of the genesis of the Levitical offering system to gain favor with God and seek forgiveness more so than it is tithing. Just a thought. I don't know.
Yeah.
You can debate that if you're watching this with some people you know.
That's right.
I do think that maybe Abraham in Genesis 14, do one of y'all have that?
I actually do.
Okay, read that for us, Clark. I think it's Genesis 14, 17 to 20.
17 to 20,
This is after Abraham wins a battle and God gives him the victory.
Yes, that's right. Oh, wow. Okay, so I didn't practice these words beforehand, and I already see one. It's going to be so hard to pronounce. But starting verse 17, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings, thank you, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything.
And I think this is an interesting passage because it predates the law.
It does. Yeah, that's an important thing to point out now because we want to put this into context for sure. This is Genesis 14 before the law comes out.
Right.
So,
and it's interesting he gave a tenth.
I was going to say, where do y'all think that comes from?
I really don't know.
I really have no idea either.
No idea.
Because there's no precedence that I'm aware of prior to Genesis 14 where God has required a tenth.
Yeah, not that I know of. Maybe you can comment and say you guys were wrong and it's right here in this verse, but I don't know of anywhere where that tenth came out.
I don't have an answer for you on that. It was just a sense of giving a tenth. Now, maybe that was a custom of the day, and I hate to say it that way, but maybe victories, when you won victories militarily, those who helped you maybe received a tenth from a custom, like it was just a customary thing to do. I don't know, though.
Yeah.
You've never heard Tyce, anybody talk about that?
I have not, no. I mean, I've heard the side of, this is a whole different discussion, of Melchizedek possibly being pre-incarnate Jesus.
Right.
That's why he gave the tenth, just a sense in him of the tenth needs to go to God. But, we see that Jesus is greater than Melchizedek, so that whole argument just nullifies.
Right. Correct. That's right. But I do think this is probably the roots of tithing.
I agree.
To recognize the provisions of God, especially in this battle. And so then Abraham, in response, gives him a tenth of the spoils.
So then that answers the question. We can turn the podcast off, right?
Let's move forward because this is not our only stop. We do find that in the law there were requirements to give tithes. And this is where it gets a little confusing for most of us if we're not careful, because the law had multiple tithes, not just one.
Right.
So y'all want to talk about that?
You got anything?
I just think, we can talk about how there were really a lot of different requirements for tithing. It was some went to the priests.
That's
right.
Correct. The Levitical priest received a tithe.
To the Levitical priest, there we go. And then some were for the poor.
That's correct.
And off the top of my head, I can't remember. There might have been 3.
The third tithe was usually affiliated with a feast. So if you came to certain festivals or feast, in the Jewish calendar, then you would bring a tithe to those. So there were 3 tithes, really. And I'm sure our church people would not want to hear that on a Sunday morning.
You need to give 30%.
Yeah. There's 10% going to the priest or the preachers, and then there's this festival tithe, and then there's this poor tithe. Now, that was not 10, 10, and 10.
Right,
it was
right.
actually a different numerical system there. But there were 3 different types of feast in the Old Testament. Now, our previous episode was about how we can not worry about the law.
Yep.
Because Jesus fulfilled the law, and it's now written on our hearts. So that brings us to, what did Jesus have to say about the tithe? And I think, Clark, you had some thoughts about that.
I actually did not have Jesus's remarks. I think that might have been Tyce. So
Okay,
we'll let
Tyce
him.
may have had those. So give those to us,
I am
Tyce.
at Matthew 23:23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These you ought to have done, without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out the gnats and swallowing a camel, which that last part's just crazy to me. I don't even know what that means, but swallowing a camel. But, I mean, even Jesus here is talking about how they're just trying to uphold and please God via a tithe. But back to what I talked about in the last podcast of the law, obedience is more important, and living out the rest of the law. I mean, we see the 2 greatest laws are love God, love people. And they have not done any of that. They haven't loved God in their tithe. They also haven't loved people and neglected everything else that they're supposed to do.
Right. And that was actually the same passage I'd written down in my notes for today. We were going on the same passage, because I was thinking Jesus really condemned the people who kept the tithe the best because their hearts were not correctly aligned with God or loving people.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's good.
That is good. I've actually heard people defend tithing from that exact passage, though, because they're like, Jesus at least mentions the tithe.
Yeah.
So, of course, it's important, because even though he's talking about it actually in a lesser manner to other things in this context, he does still talk about it. And I think it's very interesting.
I've heard somebody say that before, too, that he didn't condemn it.
Right, exactly.
He condemned the spirit of it, but he didn't condemn the actual giving of it.
Yeah.
And I've heard somebody use that as a justification.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing.
Yeah.
So, all right, well, let's move forward. Is the tithe still required in the New Testament?
That's ultimately the question everybody clicked on this podcast.
Yeah, they wanted to
right?
know this, so let's get to it.
Can I keep my 10%?
Yeah, that's right. Can I keep my 10%? So dive into that.
Well, I think I have just 3 really easy points, and the first one is that we aren't under the Mosaic covenant anymore. And that's where I have, this was, you guys talked about it last week, and this is me trying to jump back in, pretend like I was there last week. But
get your 2 cents in.
Yeah, exactly. And I have Romans 6:14 to use. And it says, for sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace. And then just to move on to verse 15, what then, are we to sin because we are not under law, but under grace? By no means. So I didn't want that to be taken out of context, throw that last verse in there. But I love that just Paul talks about, we're not under law, but we're under grace now. So that Mosaic law is not held to us anymore. The second thing I had was, we're not Levites. I mean, we're sitting here together, and we're not Levitical priests.
No, we're not.
So if you're trying to tithe purely based on the Mosaic covenant, you've got to go find somebody else, because we're not
Jewish Levites.
Exactly. So that's some Jewish Levites, because we're not your right people. But the third thing, and this was the first time I'd ever heard this, was from Mr. Bill Miller in the church. It was at an F4 fellowship at his house, and he pointed out tithing is not mentioned or required in the New Testament. There is no requirement of it in the New Testament. And I was so shocked to have heard that. I was like, you're kidding. Because I was taught, of course, that it was so important. So I just thought, those are my 3 little quick points that I had about what we do with it today. Do y'all have any thoughts on those?
Tyce, you want to dive in?
I mean, to just answer your question, do you get to keep your 10%? I mean, yes, at the end of the day, you can keep your 10%. But what are you doing with that? Like, are you just keeping it selfishly? Because then you're back at the problem of the Pharisees. Because it's not mentioned in the New Testament, as Clark has said. But, I mean, we are still required to give with a cheerful heart, and we are required to serve and do these things for God. So, can you keep your 10%? Yeah, but what are you doing with it?
And I guess that's where I was going to go. I had 3 different passages that were going to illustrate, really from the book of Acts and 2 Corinthians, that the early church, after Jesus' ascension and the Spirit had come, they were motivated by generosity more than trying to obey a law. And so in Acts chapter 2, when the church is gathered together after Pentecost, they're selling their possessions to love one another. Let's go back to your concept, Tyce, that you mentioned, that the two commands, that the law can be summarized in two commands: love God and love each other. So we see that they're beginning to use the tithe, whatever they give, whatever you want to call that, to help other people. They're loving each other in the church.
Yep.
And so that continues in the same way in Acts chapter 4 with Barnabas. He does the same thing. He has a piece of land. He hears of a need in the church. And so in generosity and love for the people, he gives, sells the land and gives the money to the church to use for the good of the people.
Mm-hmm.
And the same principle comes into play for Paul in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 8, when there's a need among the Jewish believers in a time of famine. He rallies the Gentile churches to give faithfully and regularly, so that an offering can be given to fellow brothers and sisters in the Jewish faith who are from the Jewish community. So it looks like to me that there's this shift from giving just purely out of obedience to a law to we want to be generous so that it honors God and loves people. So I really liked what you said a minute ago.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah, jump in.
So let's go all the way back to Genesis 14.
Okay.
There we go.
And we see Abraham gives the first 10
Yes.
to Melchizedek, but he loved people more than anything else too, because chapter 14 ends in verse 24. I will take nothing but what my young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their shares. So the rest went to other people.
To other people.
Abraham only took the spoil of war what his men had already taken or what they earned.
So he gave a portion to God.
He gave a portion,
which honored the love of God.
But just like in the New Testament, everything else besides what he needed went to everyone else that was there. And that's where Sapphira and the other one,
Ananias and Sapphira,
messes up, because they did need some, but they wanted to pretend and share the rest with everyone else. And so that principle does come from, I believe, Abraham in that.
I appreciate you bringing it up, because I don't think I've heard anybody say that until just now.
Yeah,
and I like
incredible full circle moment there. So way to tie
it really was
back in.
That's very good. I appreciate you doing that. So if we don't have to give a 10% legal requirement, do you think it's okay if a family gives 2% or 7%, or could they give 25%? How do you feel about that?
I think that's a really good question. I think that at the end of the day, we are asked to give generously. And I actually had the same passages written down that you just used in Acts 2 and chapter 4.
Oh, okay, good.
And I just think that there were fantastic points is they were willing to give. And that's what we're commanded to do. We are commanded to give generously. I actually have 1 Corinthians 9 here. And I just wrote the whole thing because so much of it talks about giving. But I just have a few verses to read. And I might have lost. Okay, 13 and 14 says, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. And I had never even... I've read 1 Corinthians before, but I had never really made note of this. That last verse 14, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. I thought that was just an incredible part to read, is we are supposed to support our church. We are supposed to support our leaders and help them to make their living, because this is what the Lord has called us into to do for our living. So at the end of the day, I would say, and then I'll let you guys finish up, but I would say pray about it, ask the Lord. Look at your finances. We've done budgeting episodes before. Go back to those budgeting episodes. Look at your finances and see what you can give. And then I would even encourage you to go past that point. Look at what you can give and go a little bit past that point, because we are called to be uncomfortable in our faith, and push a little bit beyond what you think you can give, and use that.
You got thoughts, Tyce?
Yeah, so I think this is the second time I'm going to go back to something that you said in church. And this might have been a private conversation that we had, but you talked about how if you're not in crisis, that's a sign of you praying for others. The same is true, I guess, with tithing. If you're in a financially good spot, that is your sign to be able to give more. But if financially you are struggling, I think there's still a sense of being faithful and giving to the Lord. So I wouldn't say you should ever not give. But if that's 1%, if that's 2%, that's 0.5% of what you've earned. If you're in that crisis, that's okay, as long as you're still being faithful. But in your times of not crisis, then I believe that you should be probably giving more. And whether that is just money, or that's time and money, or that's money in something else, money in possessions, I think you should be giving what you can when you can.
Mm-hmm. So as a follow-up to this concept that we're talking about,
Yes.
God owns everything. And so we're just simply stewards of what he has given us. But I do appreciate what you've just said there, Tyce, as we kind of draw the end of this question. There could be a season where your family could go through a crisis and you might not be able to give as much as you would like for that season. But there's going to be a season after that where God maybe puts you in a better financial place. And the goal is always generosity.
That's
because
right.
you can't outgive God.
No, you cannot.
And that's why I want to go to 2 Corinthians 9:6. The point is this: the person who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the person who sows generously will also reap generously. Now, that may be where your mother and a lot of people that I know got that concept of
I agree.
You give and the Lord's going to take care of it. It's probably out of that concept. And then it says, each person should do as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or out of compulsion, since God loves a cheerful giver. And this is it. And God is able to make every grace overflow to you, so that in every way, always having everything you need, you may excel in every good work. And so I just wanted to kind of say, God owns it all. He knows your resources because he's given them to you. There could be seasons where 2 or 6 or 8's all you can give, but there are probably going to be seasons after that where you might could give 12, 15, 20. And I think we need to be sensitive to the Spirit in this. So it's not a legal requirement. And I guess at the end of the day, it's about the motive of our heart.
I agree.
It has to do more with the motive than the money, the amount of money.
That was a wonderful passage to end us on right there.
So now I do have one final little quick question. I know COVID kind of changed the way churches do offerings. Do you think that us not passing the basket in the service like we have done in the past has diminished our understanding of giving?
Wow.
That's a good question.
What a question.
I think I have. So me and Brooklyn, we've discussed this before. And I've been working through it because there might be a sense of pride in it. But to not pass the basket and just to be able to set up automatic giving for me becomes an issue, because now did I ever give at all? And so maybe there's some pride in that of I need to feel like I've given. But I do, if there's a sense also of me wanting to honor God, and I need to physically do that. If not, I can leave it in the background, and then I feel like I'm not honoring God anymore because I don't think about it. I'm not giving with a cheerful heart.
Yeah.
It's just something that happens.
It's a deduction, just like a lot of other bills.
It's just like a tax.
Yeah.
It's something that I don't get, and I have no choice of whether I give it or not. And so it's working out. Me and her are working it out together of what is that pride in me or not. But I do think some people, if they think like me, that might cause some issues of not passing the plate anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm a little more traditional, so I had not faced this problem. I've never gone to the online giving before. We always say there will be men in the back with a basket, and I just write my check and put it in there. So I feel like for me, the answer was no, because I still felt that pain. No, no, I'm just kidding. I'm cheerful giver. But I still did feel, this is me doing it. So I had not ever thought about that. That's a good question. What about you? What do you think?
It's an interesting dynamic because our giving has not diminished, and I would say in some regards it might have even increased once we put the online options in as an available option during COVID. And so many people do. I would say the vast majority of the people in our church now use the online option. And it's just like you talked about, Tyce. It's a set-up draft that comes out of their bank account.
I didn't even know it did that.
Yeah, it's just set up where every month or every week, however they set it up, it draws an amount out of their bank account, puts it in the churches. And I would say 75 to 80% of the money we get comes through that.
And that's fantastic. I mean,
yeah, which is
praise
wonderful.
God that people are faithfully giving.
But it does make me wonder, I'm going back to my childhood where we started this whole discussion. When my parents gave me a quarter as a kid, there was something about learning every week I'm giving something back to God because he's given me all that I have. And I wonder if the next generation of kids will understand that concept because they've never seen their parents give and they've never seen an offering basket. If they're born after COVID and they've come to worship, they've never seen an offering basket passed at Cross Point, at least.
Right.
And maybe in other churches as well. So there's a little bit of a concern, have we lost that understanding of a part of worship is giving?
That's a good question.
So I don't have an answer for it, but it's on my heart.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
Thank y'all for your insights on tithing. This has been a good topic today. As always, we would say to those of you watching and listening, we don't have all the answers, but we're trying to walk with these subjects through in a way that you can think about them additionally when you are with other people and other believers. So I hope today's has been the same. We hope you'll have a great day and come back and join us for the next Table Talks.